Up next, we're going to move on to selecting objects in both the 3D viewport and the outliner panel. Starting with the 3D viewport, in our default scene we have 3 different objects. We have the cube object, the light object, and the camera object. We can select an object by left clicking within the 3D viewport. So if I wanted to select my light object, I would hover my cursor over and left click. If I want to select my camera, just left click. Simple as that. Now in Blender, when an object has been selected, it will have a yellowish orange highlight that surrounds it, and this is the case with all object types. You can also select multiple objects at the same time, and there are various ways to do this. One method is to hold down the Shift key on your keyboard and then select a second object. You can select as many objects as you want using this method. So holding down the Shift key, left click, and now the camera has been selected. So we have 3 objects that are a part of our selection, but you'll notice that they now have 2 different outlines. The camera has our yellowish highlight, and both the light and cube are highlighted in a much deeper orange. This indicates that they are part of the selection, but only one object can be classed as the active selection, which is typically, in this case, the last object that we select. If I hold down Shift and select an object that is already a part of the selection, I merely switch the active object between the 2. So by holding down the Shift key, we can change which of these objects is the active selection. While we're not going to be going into any detail of how this can affect our projects in this class, it is important to remember how this behaviour occurs in the 3D viewport, because there are a lot of tools that are dependent on which objects are the active objects. If we left click away from any of our objects, we can deselect them. Alternatively, if we wanted to select all of the objects in our scene, we can press the A key on our keyboard and all of our objects will be selected. In order to deselect everything, again, we can either left click away from the objects or we can use the hotkey combination, which is to hold down Alt and press A. Finally, we have the various methods of selection such as box select. If we come over to the side of the 3D viewport, we have access to a tool shelf. And the first tool here is the Select Box tool. What we can do here with this tool active is click and drag using our mouse cursor and create a box. Anything within that box is going to be selected. So for example, I can make my box this big and it will select the cube and light once I release the left mouse button. I can change my type of selection by holding down the left mouse button on the tool icon. This will bring up a secondary menu, which allows me to choose different methods for selecting objects. For example, we can go with the Select Circle option. This creates a circle that surrounds our mouse cursor. If I wanted to, I can increase the radius by coming up here to the 3D viewport header. So let's click and drag to make a larger radius. Now I'm going to click and drag, and any objects that fall within my circle are going to be selected. And I have better control over selecting multiple objects at the same time using Circle Select. The third option here is Select Lasso, which allows us to click and drag to create a customized shape. And once again, if any objects are found within this shape, they will be selected. So those are the different ways in which we can select our objects in the 3D viewport, but we can also select objects in the outliner panel. This is going to be useful if you have a much larger project with dozens or even hundreds of objects within it. You can use the outliner panel to identify the object that you want to select and then left click. The object will be highlighted blue in the outliner panel, and it will also be selected in the 3D viewport. So we can left click to select any of the objects that we want from the outliner panel. We also have the ability to select two objects at the same time by holding down the Shift key. So if we hold down Shift and select the light object, then we select the light object as a part of our selection. However, it actually acts in reverse compared to using the Shift key in the 3D viewport. So the original object that we selected remains the active. The light is simply added to that selection. If we hold down the Control key and left click, we can further add to the selection within the outliner, but if we use the Control key on our keyboard, the next object we select is going to become the active one. So let's just recap the difference between selecting in the 3D viewport and the outliner. We can select in both panels a single object by using the left mouse button. To select multiple objects in the 3D viewport, we use the Shift key and select. As we add to our selection, the last object that we have chosen is going to be the active object. By comparison, if we left click on an object in the outliner, we select it, and then if we use Shift left click, we add a second object to the selection, but the original model will still be the active object. To mirror what happens in the 3D viewport, we actually have to use the Control key when selecting objects in the outliner panel. And now whatever object I select last is going to be the active object, which is the same as in the 3D viewport. Now there are many more ways in which we can select models and the geometry of models, but that should cover all of the fundamental ways in which we can select our objects within Blender.